CEC Gurukul lecture. In continuation with the series on sociology of work, in today's lecture I am going to discuss about gender segregation. Gender segregation which exists at the level of vertical segregation and horizontal segregation. So to understand whether there has been a decline or an increase, or what Devina Fiona says that gender segregation has become more complex. It's not as visible, but yet they could be when we look into data, we look into the statistics, and we look into how women have been able to progress in their life. So we kind of have get a hint that there is the persistence of gender segregation. And to explain this, I'm going to make reference to Devina Fiona's work on men, women and engineering. Now this is a case study, an ethnographic study of women in engineering profession, and she's going to understand how the gender segregation has continued. Now why do we take engineering? Because engineering has been, if we look into historically, has been an industry which was dominant by men. You know, it was kind of considered as a men profession. So when we were growing up in schools, and something that continues even today, we see that when we are about to kind of complete our class 12 board exam, there is a clear-cut difference given in the family. So the women are supposed to take up medical courses, prepare for medical and become doctors, whereas most of the men or the boys are kind of prompted to take on engineering courses, prepare for engineering exams and become engineers. So the general commonsensical understanding was that women are better doctors and boys are better engineers. So this continues, you know, in terms of the society deciding which profession is suited to which gender. So if we kind of look into engineering, it was, or rather even today we see, it is a profession which is dominated by men, and for a very long time it has this kind of a social closure of women. Even today, though number of women, if we compare it say 2-3 decades back, has increased, but when we look into the ratio of the students of men, girls and boys in any engineering college, it is still kind of a ratio which is lower for the women. So when we look into the study on men, women and engineering, we refer to Wolve, Sylvia Wolve's work, and here she's kind of talking about how engineering as a profession was excluded to women, or it was kind of a profession which had a very strong union. And the strong union was obviously dominated by men, and these men did not want women to enter into it. So it kind of the recruitment process, the men in the union or men at the higher level would kind of not give preference to recruitment of women. And the reason why was it that men, while growing up as young boys, kind of do both. Because they are not doing much of the domestic work, they are kind of free, they would work as apprentice. Now, and they would also study. So apprenticeship implied that they had some experience of this engineering work. So even if they did not join an engineering college, they would join the engineering profession or the work which required scientific knowledge because they had apprenticeship. So this trend was kind of something which the union thought was favorable to men. If they allowed women, then their own job would be at risk. So they did not want that, the engineering profession would be kind of looking into employment of women. So Wolve calls it as patriarchal unionism. Patriarchal unionism in the sense it was a union by men, for men, and they were kind of very dominant in ensuring that the profession did not kind of allowed any entry to the women. So simple, or in common sense we can say, the profession was barred to the women. They were not allowed to enter in it. That is what is patriarchal unionism. Now if we look into say early 20th century or late 19th century, we see the number of women were kind of almost invisible in the engineering. There were kind of no employment of women. If they were say 1 or 2 kind of exceptions. this situation kind of changes by 20th century. Early 20th century, we see the labor process itself is undergoing change, and the labor process in the sense that is kind of more outsourcing of production, industrialization is on increase. So these industries and say in factories require more people, and now then they were not kind of looking into whether it was a male or a woman. They wanted to meet the production target. So the labor process changed, and therefore women were taken into employment even if they did not have experience. But then where were the women taken into it? Women were taken at the lower level, unskilled work, because they did not have any apprenticeship, they did not have any experience. So majority of the women were employed at the lower level, and they were either recruited as semi-skilled or they were recruited as unskilled. So there was only kind of a small percentage of women, and which in literature we refer as feminization of labor. So many of the scholars kind of get very happy at the term feminization of labor and feel that there is an increase in the employment of women. Now when we segregate the data and see what does this feminization of labor means, it implies that the number of women employed in relation to men is more. So therefore it's a feminine zone. But then we need to look into the industry and we look into at the different level. So as I have already said, the largest recruitment of women or employment of women is at the lower level as unskilled, part-time, casual workers. So this kind of continued, and by say 1960s, there was a decline in women's employment. Now, the Wolwe is saying that there is a decline in women's employment. Why? Because of technological innovation. Now, women did not have the technical skill. They did not do any technical profession. Therefore, the work had to be done on machines. They had to be done, say, through computers. So, women did not have the knowledge of operating a computer or a machine, so they lost the job. So, 1980s recession kind of accelerated the rate of, because the economy was going down and there was a recession in the market, it would be kind of again a gendered kind of understanding that if the economy was already going down, it would be better for women to give up their job than the men, because again kind of keeping back the gender stereotype that men are regarded as the primary bread earner. So who had to sacrifice the job? It had to be women, and therefore there was a further decline of job. Now, this theory of Wolwe kind of saying that there is kind of increase and then decline due to technology has been criticized, and it is kind of criticized that it is a partial account, and it does not look into the growth of high level occupation and the gendered implication. So when we look into 1960s and 70s, there was also the demand for highly skilled personnel due to IT revolution, and there was also the growth of service sector. So there was kind of decline in the technical job, but service sector, basically those which were kind of concerned with providing care or were kind of related to human services, women's employment increased. So this it's not something which can be of the same for across. So when we look into feminization of labor, this theory was more in terms of production, export factories, say textile export or garment export, where women's fingers, nimble fingers, soft fingers were used to kind of increase production. So in these industries, in these factories across South Asia, we see that there was an increase in, but there were certain sectors where there was no employment of women, and or rather there was kind of a decline. So we cannot arrive, it's not as very simple. We have to do a sector-wise study to understand whether there is a decline or an increase. Now when we look into the nature of women's employment, especially in the engineering sector, because the argument is that because of the three conditions, increased recruitment of entry of women into professional courses, equal opportunity legislations, and the women's movement, the kind of women entered into high technical jobs. And again, we can look into, say, gender segregation, that women were entering into those jobs which was a kind of clean sector, where you would have to do data processing, or you have to kind of be presentable. So the fair sex was again taken into account, and women were employed in areas where it could have kind of given in more client or more of customer. Very small percentage of women were entering into technical areas, right? So only 2%. Data from the study says only 2% of women in the engineering colleges. And this kind of, is again a gendered kind of an understanding, where see the number of women who are entering in the engineering college would be high, but then it is not the same percentage of women who would take up employment. So even acquiring a certain engineering professional degree would not necessarily be for employment. It could be to kind of be a tag or a brand for your family, that yes, my daughter is an engineer, but that's kind of also a negotiation, say, in the marriage market. So there is no correlation that if women in the engineering college were high, the employment would be also high. So if we look into the increase in employment of women, this is again another interesting data, that the number of scholars are saying that there has been increase. Now that increase they are comparing only for the women. Say in the 1940s, if there were no women, 1970s they are saying that yes, 10 women are there. But then if we compare it with men, because we are looking into gender, we see the rate of employment of men was much faster. So if in 1940s there were 10 men, by 1960s, 70s there were 100 men. So the rate of employment of men were far more higher than the rate of employment of women. And men, they enjoyed the increase in employment opportunity. Why? Because the number of employment opportunities, say in the technical sides, improved. Say with the coming of computers or coming of the machines, it favored men because they already had some amount of knowledge, apprenticeship. So they kind of easily entered into this. Now another barrier in terms of women not taking up engineering work is also the question of night shift, or the kind of working in the night, which after a very long legislations that women would be allowed to work at night, and the employer would protect the transportation of the women from home and office. But earlier, say 1940s, 50s, this was a huge problem, that women could not take up job because it would require them to do shift. So many of the women kind of did not agree to it. So what are we then trying to say? That educational qualification is not necessarily an indication of women's employment or increase in women's employment, because the work is gendered, the social cultural practices are gendered, and that is kind of needed to understand gender segregation. So what are the factors? If we look into the engineering sector and we say women have entered, yet there is a gender segregation, what are the sectors? Number one is the persistence of a gendered nature of subject choice that we all know. And it's something that is kind of very common in India, that girls are kind of were believed to be bad in maths, and they were believed to be kind of good in subjects like home science and social science. But this is again an assumption. There are many women who are far more technically minded and have a higher level of IQ than men. But then that kind of decided the choice of occupation, that it is always better for women to take a soft skill and something which is not very demanded. And another interesting data that was evident again from India is when we look into these secondary and primary education. And this is again something which we observe with increase in social media. Most of our parents kind of take a pride in showcasing the achievements of their children, young primary school children. And if we look into the performance, it is the girls who are much better performer. Secondary education, class 10 and 12 board result, women, girls are always on the top. But then this data kind of suddenly changes. Higher education, whether we look into the IIT top ranker, or we look into the, say, chartered accountancy and other exam, we see the data, all of a sudden the data changes and the boys kind of are better performer than the girls. So this implies that there is some amount of pulling back of girls from the education system. So probably those who were the good performers have not been given a chance to go for the higher studies, and therefore they become invisible from the data. So those who have acquired higher education, that is those who were kind of fortunate enough to get the family support and the society support and continue with the higher education system, kind of also did not have the appropriate credentials. Credentials in the sense in that you are not exposed. Most of the mobility of women are restricted, so the exposure is not. So you are not confident enough to kind of join an industry or join a job which will be kind of very demanding or could be kind of difficult. So you will then again be very kind of hesitant to take such job. So second kind of look into it is that there is a limited supply of women because of pullback. Women are kind of even kind of, if we look into the dropout rate also, it's coming off very high for the women, girl child than the boys. So there's a limited supply of women, especially as we go higher in the higher technical education. The number of women are comparatively very low. So there is kind of no substantial change because the number is still very low, and even because the numbers is low, and gender has kind of become a tagline. So you want to kind of portray that you are gender sensitive. You want to show that the company or the brand is kind of supporting gender. So in that sense, these women then become the tagline or the front line for these brands and companies. So this study, this ethnographic study, is based on interaction between professional engineers and scientists in 10 companies, and they are trying to understand the outcome of the equal opportunity policies, whether it kind of helped in bringing about decline in gender segregation or not. And the study by Fiona Devina tries to study the hypothesis that when there is an increase in employment of women, or when women are entering into higher profession like engineering and scientists, there should be a decline. So this assumption is being questioned or rather explored, and we will kind of come to the study comes to a conclusion that despite the entry of women, despite the higher qualification of women, gender segregation kind of continues or persists. So this study was a result of the initiative in the 1980s and 90s. 1980s, 70s, 80s, the women's movement was very active, the second wave women's movement, and the women's movement was talking, they were demanding for equal opportunity, especially the liberal feminists. They were demanding equal work, equal pay for the larger amount of work. So all these legislations or policies for gender employment was the outcome of that. So what was the finding of this study in the engineering profession? The first finding says that most of the women in the engineering sector professions were young. That implies that they were not married. They could be just before their marriage. So they were all young, just pass out from college before they actually start off the domestic work. So they were restricted to a certain age. Whereas men, they were from all age. They were young boys who was apprentice, and they could be say men in 30s, 40s, and also the older ones. So all age men were there, but women were only from a particular age group. Only 11 women and 29 men had commitment towards their children. This is what tells us that marriage kind of also and this is again something that we have heard around and been very familiar with, that most of the women, they withdraw from the market, they withdraw from the labor market, they either kind of take a break 2 years, 4 years, 5 years, because they are into marriage and reproduction and nurturing of children. Only few are kind of taking on both the task, and that is kind of demand to kind of balance both. So only 11 women with children. Whereas for men, marriage is not a barrier, so they can be having children, yet they can be fully commitment to the work. So the third finding is that all women employee had an engineering degree. They were qualified engineers. Whereas for men, there were some who were without degree from engineering college. These were the men who kind of entered as apprentice and they progressed. So they worked for a several number of years, and even though they did not have a engineering degree, they continued to work because they had the work experience. So women only enter the profession after getting a higher qualification. So you become eligible to enter the profession only when you have got the qualification. But men, they kind of it's kind of a progressive understanding that while they were doing study or while doing college life, was doing the internship or they were doing apprenticeship. So your entry into the labor market is much young, at an younger age. So the years of experience, which would be important for the time of promotions and progression, the men will have more years of experience than women. So that would bar women from rising beyond a certain level. So then when we look into recruitment, this study looks into the recruitment policy, and there is a kind of increase in the employment in engineering also because there has been change in the recruitment policy. We have already said that equal opportunities policies has changed. Then there was a skill shortage. Say after a point of time, not many men wanted to enter into engineering because they have larger choice to make. So there was a shortage. So the engineering professions then started taking on women. And also kind of women as employee, and there is a lot of literature on this, are more committed. They are kind of considered as better human capital. They do not generally rise up in revolt. They are submissive. So a lot of gender stereotype comes into it when the policies of recruitment are kind of be made. Then there were a number of steps or measures taken to enhance employment of women, and these were that number one was that there was no discrimination at the entry level. So there was the kind of it was not said that it was only open for men, it was open for both men and women. So that was a change in the recruitment policy. The second was a lot of advertisements were done in graduate brochure, that is engineering college brochures, which women who were studying there would look into it and then join the engineering firm. The most important provision was maternity leave provision, and this maternity leave provision is now kind of formal, the legal right of every woman. So the maternity leave provision is to ensure that women career path is not kind of staggered or does not kind of break in between. She does not have to leave a job and then again kind of look for one. So you kind of take your leave of this kind of sanction, which is again there's a difference between the formal and informal in terms of the number of days for maternity leave, but then kind of it is granted to the women. The fourth strategy was kind of putting forward women success story. There were a lot of engineers, women engineers, who would go to the colleges and give lectures, give talks, and share their story of success. So that success would kind of also motivate other girls, other women to join the profession. So, but when we look into the response, that were women happy about this, where they were being sent to colleges as a kind of giving lecture or the brand ambassador. So women were not very happy about this, because some of them was thinking that when the number of women was already less, and they had to do this extra work. This was not part of the normal routine engineering work. This is something only for the brand image of the company. So they were sent for lectures and talk about how the company is gendered and how it is policy. It is kind of abiding by the equal opportunity policies. But what harm did it do to the women? For the women, they were kind of taken aback from their main work. They were not doing the engineering work. Most of the time they were either preparing for the lecture or delivering the lecture. So they became a publicity material. It was only used for public relations and lip service. So such policies was only kind of good for company's image, but not for women. Why not for women? Because the women were then not able to actually do the work that they had actually got the qualification for. So they were not kind of doing any of the engineering work, any of the art. And then when at the time of the promotion, this knowledge was absent. They did not have the knowledge because they were already overburdened with publicity work, and therefore they would be kind of not qualified for promotion. That is why there was a critique to this publicity material, that is women were used as publicity material. Then there were also change in recruitment procedures. If we look into the recruitment procedures of the engineering and professionals, they have been changed. One of the change that is there in the recruitment procedure is that women are not asked about their personal relations. They are not asked whether they have a friend or they have a husband, how many children. It is now more in terms of the professional or the education that they have acquired. And there is no kind of assumption on gender stereotype, on kind of if you have children then you cannot commit. So these certain assumptions are not there used to judge the qualification of the women. And third major change is, earlier all the board, that is the recruitment board that would recruit the employees, consisted only of men. Now the change is that not of the recruitment board there is a women, and therefore discrimination is less. But despite this change, what is problematic is that there is a mindset which prevents women from entering into the technical sector, and this would be more among the older, say older manager, the senior manager. The young managers and the recruitment, they have acquired some amount of training in gender sensitization, but the older ones are still kind of biased and have lot of so what can be kind of concluded is that the selection process has changed. It has gone about a lot of changes, but yet there are some kind of mindset, some kind of policies not getting translated into practices, and that is why we see the dominance of men in these industry, and their deep-seated convictions, mindset for men and women worker. So the entire kind of conclusion that we can draw is that men are good managers and practitioners, and they will remain hostile to women. So the gender character of education is a block and cannot help us. So the liberal feminist strategy that more work and equal pay has not worked out, and there is kind of a lot of gender stereotypes which affect the relations between men and women in the engineering sector. For reference, you can read Davina Fiona, published in 1992, the Gender Segregation in the Engineering and Science Profession, a case of continuity and change. So here, this is the reference which I used for understanding the case study. So with this, we come to an end of today's lecture. Thank you.